courtroom went silent when my husband laughed and said, "You're leaving with nothing. You never built anything without me." His mistress sat beside him, smiling like the victory was already hers. They thought I was the desperate wife begging for a fair divorce settlement. They thought my years of sacrifice meant nothing. But then the judge opened the letter I had submitted just minutes earlier. He read the first few lines, stopped, and looked directly at my husband. His expression changed completely. "Mr. Anderson," he said quietly, "you should hear what your wife has to say. My name is Emily Carter, and I was 29 years old when I realized the man I had spent nearly a decade loving was someone I barely recognized. When I first met Daniel, I thought I had found the person I would grow old with. He was charming, ambitious, and the kind of man who made everyone around him feel important. We met at a charity event through mutual friends, and within months, I knew he was different. He made me laugh, listened to my dreams, and promised me we would build a life together. For years, we did exactly that. I supported Daniel through every challenge in his career. When he worked late nights, I stayed awake waiting for him. When he had stressful projects, I became the person who encouraged him. I celebrated his promotions, helped him prepare for important meetings, and stood beside him whenever life became difficult. I never saw marriage as a competition. I believed when one person succeeded, both people succeeded. But slowly, things started changing. Daniel began coming home later than usual. At first, I convinced myself it was just work. His phone was always in his hand, but whenever I walked into the room, he would quickly turn the screen away. He stopped sharing details about his day and started feeling like a stranger sitting across from me at dinner. I asked him if something was wrong. He always gave the same answer. "Emily, you're overthinking everything." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe the man I loved was still there. But then I started noticing things I couldn't ignore. A dinner receipt from a restaurant I knew he never visited. A hotel charge hidden inside our account statements. Messages that disappeared before I could read them. And then came the moment that changed everything. I discovered he had been seeing another woman. When I confronted him, I expected guilt. I expected an apology. Instead, Daniel looked at me calmly and said he was already thinking about divorce. He thought he had the advantage. He thought I had nothing to fight for. What he didn't know was that I had saved every piece of evidence, every conversation, and every document. And soon, he would realize he had underestimated me. The day Daniel filed for divorce, he walked into our house like he had already won. There was no sadness in his eyes. No regret. No hesitation. He looked almost relieved, as if ending our marriage was just another business decision he had already calculated. "I think this is for the best," he said coldly. For the first time in years, I realized something painful. Daniel wasn't leaving because our marriage had failed. He was leaving because he believed he had found something better. And he wanted me gone quietly. During the divorce process, Daniel became a completely different person. The man who once promised to love me forever now treated me like an obstacle standing in his way. He hired an expensive attorney and started telling everyone his version of the story. According to him, I had done nothing to contribute to his success. He claimed I was just someone who had been along for the ride. That hurt more than I expected. Because he knew the truth. He knew the nights I stayed awake while he chased his dreams. He knew the sacrifices I made. He knew how many times I put my own plans aside because I believed we were building a future together. But Daniel had rewritten our entire marriage in his mind. The worst part was that his mistress, Rachel, seemed to believe every word. She started appearing at places where she knew people would see her with him. She acted like she had already taken my place. Like she was the winner of some competition I never agreed to enter. During one meeting before the hearing, Daniel looked at me and smiled. "You should be realistic, Emily. You don't have much here. Fighting this will only waste your time." I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply nodded. Because while Daniel was busy celebrating his victory, I was quietly preparing something he never expected. I had collected bank statements, saved messages, documented conversations, and organized every piece of evidence that showed what had really happened. But there was one thing I prepared that mattered more than all the documents. A letter. A letter explaining the truth behind our marriage. Daniel thought it was just the desperate words of a woman who had lost everything. He had no idea it would become the one thing that changed the entire courtroom. The morning of the divorce hearing, I woke up earlier than usual. For a few minutes, I just stared at the ceiling, remembering the life I thought I had built with Daniel. The vacations, the celebrations, the promises we made, and all the moments when I believed we were a team. But that version of my marriage was gone. When I arrived at the courthouse, Daniel was already there. He was wearing an expensive suit, smiling confidently, and standing beside Rachel. They looked completely comfortable, almost like they were attending a celebration instead of ending a marriage. Rachel looked at me and smiled. Not a friendly smile. A smile that said she believed she had already won. Daniel leaned toward his attorney and whispered something. They both laughed quietly. I knew they wanted me to feel small. They wanted me to walk into that courtroom feeling defeated. But I didn't. I sat quietly, holding the folder containing my evidence and the letter I had written. When the hearing began, Daniel spoke first. He talked about our marriage as if it was nothing more than a mistake. He claimed he had built everything himself and that I had no right to ask for anything. Then he looked directly at me and said the words I would never forget. "You'll never touch my money again." His voice was filled with confidence. Rachel smiled beside him. For a moment, the courtroom felt silent. Everyone expected me to react. But I didn't. Because I knew the truth was about to speak for itself. The judge reviewed the documents that had been submitted. Then he picked up my letter. "This is your personal statement?" he asked. "Yes, Your Honor," I replied. He opened it and started reading. At first, his expression remained neutral. Then something changed. He paused. He looked back at Daniel. The confidence on Daniel's face slowly disappeared. The judge continued reading the letter, line by line. He read about the sacrifices I had made, the promises Daniel had broken, and the truth behind the person everyone thought he was. The room became completely silent. Rachel stopped smiling. Daniel shifted nervously in his chair. And then the judge looked up from the letter and said something that changed everything. "Mr. Carter, you should have been very careful before assuming your wife had nothing to offer." The judge placed my letter down on the table and looked at Daniel with a completely different expression. The confidence he had carried into the courtroom was gone. "Mr. Carter," the judge said calmly, "there are several statements in your testimony that appear to conflict with the evidence provided." Daniel immediately sat up. His attorney quickly tried to respond, explaining that emotions could sometimes make people misunderstand situations. But the judge wasn't interested in excuses. He wanted facts. And the facts were finally coming out. The documents I had submitted revealed things Daniel never expected anyone to see. The financial records showed money that had been moved without my knowledge. The messages showed conversations he claimed never happened. The timeline proved that while he was telling everyone our marriage had simply fallen apart, he had already been building a new life behind my back. Rachel's expression changed completely. The woman who had walked into the courtroom believing she was replacing me suddenly looked uncertain. She looked at Daniel. But Daniel had no answers. For years, he had controlled the story. He decided what people believed. He presented himself as the successful husband who was simply moving on. But in that courtroom, the truth didn't need a performance. It only needed evidence. Daniel finally turned toward me. "You planned all of this?" he asked. I looked at him and shook my head. "No, Daniel. You did." The room became silent. "You made these choices. You hid these things. You created this situation. I'm just the person who stopped protecting your lies." For the first time since the divorce started, Daniel looked afraid. Not angry. Not confident. Afraid. Because he realized the person he had underestimated was the person who knew him better than anyone. The judge continued reviewing the information and explained that the court would consider all evidence before making a final decision. Daniel's perfect plan was falling apart. The money, the image, the confidence, everything he believed gave him power was disappearing. And the most important thing he lost that day wasn't his financial advantage. It was control over the story. Because for years, he had convinced everyone that I was the problem. But now, everyone finally knew the truth. The final divorce decision came a few weeks later. By then, Daniel was no longer the confident man who walked into that courtroom believing he could control everything. The truth had changed the way everyone saw him, including himself. The court considered all the evidence, the financial records, and the information that proved what had really happened during our marriage. I didn't get everything because I wanted revenge. I got what was fair. And more importantly, I got my freedom. For a long time, I thought losing Daniel would mean losing my entire future. I thought the end of our marriage meant the end of the life I had spent years building. But I was wrong. Sometimes losing someone who doesn't value you is the beginning of finding yourself again. Daniel and Rachel's relationship didn't last the way they imagined. A relationship built on secrets and broken promises couldn't survive once reality replaced the fantasy. Meanwhile, I started rebuilding my own life. I moved into a smaller home. I started doing things I had stopped doing during my marriage. I spent time with people who truly cared about me. I discovered that happiness didn't come from being someone's wife. It came from knowing my own worth. Looking back, the hardest part wasn't the divorce. It was accepting that the person I trusted most had chosen to hurt me. But I learned something important. Never underestimate someone who stays quiet. Silence doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes silence means someone is watching, learning, and waiting for the right moment for the truth to come out. Daniel thought he had taken everything from me. But he was wrong. He only removed himself from a life where he no longer belonged. And now, for the first time in years, I wake up every morning knowing that my life is truly mine. No lies. No pretending. Just peace. And that is something no one can ever take away from me.